As most of you know, there is an increased push nowadays from far-left activists to push radical gender theory onto teenagers and children. This, coupled with the fact that mental health professionals are obliged to affirm a young person's supposedly transgender identity, can have dire consequences. Namely, being rushed into a medicalized transition at a young age, which they may come to regret when they hit their 20s. And joining us tonight to discuss this situation among young people is someone who is more across the issue than just about anyone, journalist and columnist for Gender Clinic News and the Australian newspaper, Bernard Lane. Bernard, it is so fabulous to have you here. How
Thanks,
are
Daisy.
you?
All is good.
Well, very glad all is good. Now, look, Bernard, there are many concerning issues brought to light by you. You do such a fabulous job at it all. But one in particular was the so-called testosterone loophole, where Australian doctors were prescribing PBS-covered testosterone to girls to treat what they call an androgen deficiency, or in other words, a testicular disorder. And I mean, look, as we know, girls don't have testicles, so that would be stating the obvious. So please tell me, who on earth is buying this rot?
Well, it seems that sections of the medical profession are, and also the Federal Health Department, because this arrangement seems to be known to the Federal Health Department, and in particular to the people looking after the taxpayer subsidised pharmaceutical benefits scheme, I should say. But I think that the average Australian, if you pulled them over in the street and explained exactly what's being done here, would be in disbelief because, you know, on its face, it is a contradiction in terms. And there's a question whether or not it's legal, whether or not it constitutes fraud. I mean, the reason for restrictions on the use of taxpayer subsidised testosterone has to do with the fact that it's a powerful drug which is open to abuse, and there's a history of the Federal Health Department being concerned about overuse, over-medication of that drug. And here it's being given to females who identify as males as if they have an androgen deficiency, you know, a lack of inborn testosterone, and as if they have dysfunction with their testicles. And of course they have neither of those things. I mean, there's no proof at all that people who identify as trans have any hormonal imbalance at all. The hormonal imbalance starts once they're being treated with gender-affirming hormones.
I mean, look, it really is just quite disgusting and completely shocking. And Bernard, look, my impression here is that not just that the kids, it's not just the kids who get this in a vacuum. I mean, the parents obviously have to end up consenting to this treatment. Is there a lot of emotional blackmail from doctors to make parents buy into this?
There can be. There's certainly anecdotal reports of that. The parents are in a very difficult position, partly because many sections of the media have amplified the claim that kids who identify as trans are at uniquely high risk of suicide, and that without these medical interventions, an attempted suicide is highly likely. So the parents, you know, I think that you have to assume the parents are trying to do the best thing for their kids, but they're being put in a situation where the option seems to be a risk of death on the one hand, or these surprising sounding medical interventions on the other.
Yeah, look, it is just outrageous. And look, you, as I mentioned, you've done an awful lot of writing on this, and you wrote that transgenderism is often a social contagion among young people. In one of your articles, you've noted that there were 4 times as many girls than boys being prescribed testosterone in the 14 to 18-year-old age bracket. Now, look, I think that girls are particularly vulnerable to social pressures because they're very agreeable. They can be less assertive than boys because they have less testosterone. You know, they're very different. But look, when did trans become cool, for lack of a better word?
It's hard to pick an exact date, but I think 2015 is probably a significant year because that's the year that Vanity Fair splashed with a portrait of the former swimmer, whose name just escapes me for the moment, very well-known person who identified as female. And it was also the year that Obama, in his State of the Union address, referred to transgender rights. And around that time, from, say, roughly 2010, 2012, through to about 2015, that seems to have been when this new phenomenon took off. It coincides with the first generation of teenagers to grow up entirely on social media.
Oh, of course,
It coincides with the youth mental health crisis, which is international. And of course, the name of that swimmer was Bruce Jenner.
Ah, that's the one, yes, of course.
Who is now known as Caitlyn Jenner. So that was a big moment. And there's so much material, especially since around that time, there's been an absolute tsunami of material about trans identities, about how brave, and there's a subset of that, which is the trans kid story. Protect trans kids, brave and stunning trans kids.
Ah, yes, hashtag stunning and brave.
And those images and narratives, the suicide narrative, transitional suicide, they've become very deeply embedded in the culture. And it's not just in online and mainstream media, it's in the institutions, which is what we're dealing with the testosterone treatment. So you can see that government institutions, medical institutions have been co-opted. I don't think by any means the majority of physicians know or approve about this, but many of them who do know about it and are worried about it feel they cannot speak out or they would lose their jobs. It's the elite, the leaders of the medical societies and the activists who have managed this institutional capture. Yes,
and look, it is just quite extraordinary, the sheer power that these activists have, because like, if you look at teenagers today, I mean, social contagion with any kind of trend surely is just part of being a teenager. I mean, when I was a teenager in the early 2000s, it was the emo trend. People had, black hair and the eyeliner. Before that, it was the punk rock trend. There've always been trends in adolescence. But when you state the bleeding obvious, which is that trans is a social contagion, at least in large part, you point to TikTok, you point to Twitter, you point to social media, well, you just get called transphobic. I mean, how does that make any sense at all?
I mean, personally, I leave open the possibility that science will show some kind of biological basis for a sense of disconnection with birth sex in perhaps some very small percentage of people. But I think that when you look at the extraordinary increases in the number of teenagers, mostly female teenagers, rejecting birth sex and identifying as trans or non-binary, it's just a very plausible theory that a large part of that is being driven by social contagion. And social contagion is not necessarily a negative thing. I mean, we are tribal animals and we learn from each other all the time. It's true what you say, Daisy, about the vulnerability of adolescents and perhaps particularly female adolescents to social contagion that relates to bodily discomfort. You think about eating disorders, cutting, so-called non-lethal self-harm. And for males, I think that, suicide has a social contagion element and males seem to be a bit more prominent with that phenomenon. But I mean, you're right, there's nothing transphobic about asking this question or even putting up the theory that what we're seeing here is a social contagion, and it becomes a problem when it's medicalised. I mean, if we've got lots of kids just wandering around with blue hair, using strange pronouns, I don't think many people care about that at all. But once they want to undergo life-altering medical interventions, especially where the evidence base has been shown to be so weak and so poor, then that's a major problem. It's a social problem. It's a problem for the parents. It's a problem for schools, for the political class, though they haven't woken up to it yet in Australia. Yeah. And we have to keep talking about it until people are willing to look at it honestly.
Yes, and look, honesty really is the key thing here. I find there is so much dishonesty about this from activists, which is extremely upsetting. Now, Bernard, have you had much of a response to the data on this? I mean, surely not a lot of Australians could be thrilled to hear that their taxpayer dollars have funded more than 1,400 women and girls' access to hormone treatments.
Well, it's a bit hard to know how far that story reaches. I have a relatively small platform. I think that if the ABC were broadcasting this story about potential misuse of testosterone and the mind-bending idea that girls without testicles need cross-sex synthetic hormones. I think if the ABC were publishing that, or the Sydney Morning Herald or The Age, then I think you might start to see more of a mainstream reaction. But, I mean, the experience of those of us who've been following the gender medicine story is that, you know, time after time, some event takes place, or there's something revealed, or a lack of evidence, or a new risk found, and everyone asks the question, well, surely this has to be the tipping point. People in authority will have to wake up now. And again, that doesn't happen. So I've tried to give up picking the turning point. I think you can say, though, that in the 4 or 5 years that I've been following this, the general trend is towards more concern and more knowledge about these medical interventions, gender medical interventions with minors. And I think we see that internationally. Scandinavia and the UK would be the most obvious cases where they have, you know, following rigorous review of the evidence, they have determined that especially puberty blockers are so poorly evidenced that they ought to be considered experimental treatment and ideally confined to strictly controlled clinical trials. In the US, the situation's very polarised. You have 20+ Republican states which have passed laws restricting these gender medical interventions with minors, but the federal government under Joe Biden is aggressively promoting these medical treatments. Australia, New Zealand and Canada are, it seems to me, you know, quite backward in realising the scale of this problem and the lack of evidence for these medical interventions which are still being given as routine treatment in publicly funded state children's hospitals in Australia.
Oh gosh, it's just so completely appalling that Australia is in that basket at the moment. I do hope it changes. And yes, we all know what the federal government in the US is doing. Bernard Lane, you are marvellous. Thank you so much for joining me on the program this evening with your wonderful work.